The air in the green and gold implement dealership hung thick and heavy with the smell of new rubber, fresh paint, and something else. The cloying scent of easy credit. It was a smell Silas Blackwood had learned to distrust over the years, same as he distrusted a sky that was too clear in April, or a salesman who smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. He stood just inside the glass door, letting it hiss shut behind him, his worn denim jacket feeling a size too small under the fluorescent lights. His boots, scraped and scuffed from a lifetime of walking furrows and climbing onto iron, left no trace on the polished concrete floor. He'd kicked them clean on the bristly mat outside, a habit his father had beaten into him since he was old enough to walk. Behind the long, gleaming oak counter stood Rick Jennings, leaning back in his high-backed chair, a phone cradled between his shoulder and his ear. Rick was the son of the man who'd sold Silas's father his first two-cylinder John Deere Model A. But Rick was nothing like his old man. He wore a crisp logoed polo shirt, soft hands that had never known a grease gun, and a gold watch that caught the light whenever he gestured. He was laughing into the phone, a loud, confident sound that echoed off the high tin ceiling where brand-new tractor models were advertised on massive, colourful banners. "Yeah, Tom, a 4850 with the full rack of weights and duals," Rick said into the phone, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "We'll have it delivered by Friday, just in time to get that new piece of ground worked. No, don't you worry about the paperwork. The bank already approved it. We'll just roll it into your operating note." Silas waited, his hands tucked into his back pockets, his gaze drifting over the showroom floor. A massive John Deere 4440 stood like a green idol in the center of the room, its tires taller than he was. The price tag hanging from the steering wheel had more zeros on it than the deed to his entire farm. To him, it looked like a monument to debt. It was powerful, comfortable, and a prison on wheels. Rick finally hung up the phone, swiveling his chair around. His smile faded a fraction of a second when he saw Silas standing there. It was a look Silas was used to, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in his faded flannel shirt, his sun-creased face, and the simple fact that he wasn't Tom Gable, the man who bought a new tractor every 2 years, whether he needed one or not. "Silas," Rick said, his tone flat, "what can I do for you? Don't tell me that old 4020 of yours finally gave up the ghost. I've got a trade-in special this month, but frankly, I'd have to pay the scrapyard to haul that thing away." He chuckled, a small, superior sound. "She's running fine, Rick," Silas replied, his voice calm and even, a low rumble like an engine at idle. "Just put a new water pump on her last week. Purrs like a kitten." "A 40-year-old kitten, maybe," Rick shot back, already losing interest, his eyes flicking toward the paperwork on his desk. "So what do you need? A few filters? Some high-guard fluid?" "No," Silas said, stepping forward to the counter. He laid his calloused hands flat on the cool oak surface. "I just want to check my balance." Rick froze. He looked up from his papers, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. He leaned back in his chair and let out a real laugh this time, loud and mocking. It wasn't the friendly laugh he'd shared with Tom Gable. This one had an edge to it. "Your balance," Rick repeated, shaking his head as if he'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Silas, this isn't the feed store. We don't run a tab for oil filters. You pay when you buy. You know that." He gestured around the showroom. "The iron in this room. We deal in 5-6 figures, lines of credit, operating loans, not $5 tabs for spark plugs." The door hissed open again, and in walked Tom Gable himself. He was a big man, running to fat in his middle age, his face perpetually flushed from high blood pressure and cheap whiskey. He was wearing a brand-new seed corn cap and a clean jacket. The kind a man wears when he's been to the bank, not to the field. "Hey, Rick, just wanted to sign that final paper," Tom boomed. Then he saw Silas, his face twisted into a smirk. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." Backward Blackwood himself. "You finally decide to join the 20th century and buy a real tractor, Silas." "Just taking care of some business, Tom," Silas said, not turning to look at him. His eyes were fixed on Rick. "Business?" Tom scoffed, stepping up beside him. "What business could you have here? Your newest piece of equipment was built before I was born." Rick Jennings, seeing his star customer, played to his audience. "He wants to check his balance, Tom. Can you believe that? His account balance. The two of them shared a laugh, a duet of derision that made the air feel thin. To them, Silas was a relic, a stubborn old fool farming a quarter section his daddy left him, refusing to expand, refusing to modernize. In a world of ever-increasing yields and ever-climbing debt, Silas Blackwood was a ghost, a man who didn't understand the new rules of the game. They saw his old, paid-for equipment as a sign of poverty, not prudence. They saw his refusal to take on loans as a sign of fear, not freedom. They saw a failure. Silas didn't flinch. He just stood there, his hand still flat on the counter, his gaze unwavering. "I have an account here, Rick. From when your father ran this place, an equipment account. I'd like to see the ledger. I want to know my balance." Rick's smile tightened. This was a waste of his valuable time. "Fine," he sighed, pushing himself up from his chair with theatrical effort. "The old paper ledgers are in the back office, probably buried under a decade of dust. Wait here. Don't get your hopes up, Silas. I'm sure you've got a whole $12 in credit from that time you overpaid for a PTO shaft seal." He disappeared through a door behind the counter, leaving Silas alone with Tom Gable's smug grin. "Now, before we go any further, and before Rick comes back out with that dusty old ledger, I have to ask you folks, have you ever been in a situation like that? Judged by the truck you drive, the clothes you wear, or the simple way you carry yourself? Been looked down on by people who thought they were better than you, all the while knowing you held a truth they couldn't even comprehend? Let me know in the comments below, because that quiet strength, that hidden truth, was the very foundation of a man like Silas Blackwood. And what was written in that ledger was a story that had started more than 15 years earlier, on a cold spring day with his father's last words still echoing in his ears. The year was 1968. Lyndon Johnson was on the television talking about a war a world away. But the only war Silas felt was the one against the weather, the weeds, and the ever-present threat of a breakdown. He was 25 years old, and the weight of his father's 320 acres had settled squarely on his young shoulders. His father, a man carved from oak and granite, had been taken by a bad heart a month prior, leaving Silas with a widow for a mother, a farm that was just breaking even, and a piece of advice that would become his compass. "Son," his father had said from his bed, his voice a dry rasp, "this land will feed you, but it'll fool you too. It'll whisper sweet things in your ear when prices are high. It'll tell you to borrow, to get bigger, to sign your name on the bank's dotted line. Don't you listen. Oh no, man. The interest you pay on a loan is just you paying for tomorrow's worry today. You keep your iron old, but you keep it running. You keep your fields clean, and you keep your name clear at the bank. A man who owns what he stands on is a king. A man who owes for it is a slave." That advice ran contrary to everything happening around him. Farming was changing. The old ways were dying. Neighbors were selling out to bigger operations or taking on massive loans to buy the new, powerful tractors that could work twice the land in half the time. Tom Gable, whose farm bordered Silas's to the west, had just bought a brand new International Harvester 856 and was bragging at the co-op that he was going to be farming 1,000 acres before he was 30. Silas's main tractor was a 1964 John Deere 4020, a diesel with the classic synchro range transmission. His father had bought it used, paying cash from 2 good years of corn sales. It was a good, honest machine, but it was already considered dated. It didn't have a cab, just fenders and a sun-bleached canopy. It didn't have the creature comforts or the raw horsepower of the new models. His backup tractor for raking hay and hauling wagons was a Farmall M his grandfather had bought new after the Second World War. One afternoon in the middle of May, with half his corn yet to be planted, it happened. Silas was pulling his 6-row John Deere planter across the North 80 when he pushed in the clutch to shift down for a soft spot. The pedal went to the floor with a sickening lack of resistance, and the tractor kept rolling. The clutch was gone, not slipping but completely shot. He was dead in the water, the planter still half full of seed corn, the sun beating down on his neck. Tom Gable happened to be driving by on the county road, his new IH kicking up a plume of dust. He slowed, pulled his pickup over and sauntered into the field. "Looks like your museum piece finally gave up, Blackwood," Gable said, a chew of tobacco bulging in his cheek. "You gonna call the scrap man?" Clutch went out, Silas said, his voice tight with frustration as he stared at the useless pedal. Well, there you go, Gable said with a shrug. Perfect excuse. Take it down to Jennings. He'll give you a couple hundred for scrap and put you in a new 4430. Air conditioning, radio, 20 more horsepower. You can finance the whole thing. It's what a modern farmer would do. I'll fix it, Silas said, swinging down from the operator's station. Gable actually laughed. Fix it? Silas, you gotta split the tractor for a clutch job. That's a 3-day job for a real mechanic, and you're no mechanic. By the time you get it done, this field will be a weed patch. Just trade it in. Be smart for once. Silas just shook his head. Appreciate the advice, Tom. Gable spat a stream of brown juice near Silas's boot. Suit yourself. Some people just like doing things the hard way. He walked back to his truck, shaking his head, the very picture of modern, efficient disapproval. That night, the barn was lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the metallic tang of penetrating oil and the earthy smell of the dirt floor. Silas had the 4020 blocked up, the front-end loader disconnected and resting on stands. He'd spent the evening wrestling with rusted bolts and heavy steel, following the worn, grease-stained pages of an I&T shop manual. By midnight, he had the tractor split in two. The front half, with the engine and the wide front axle, stood like a patient beast, separated by a 3-foot gap from the transmission and rear axle housing. Inside the bell housing, the problem was obvious. The pressure plate had failed spectacularly. 3 of the activating springs had snapped, scoring the flywheel and chewing the clutch disc to pieces. It was a mess. The next morning, he drove his father's old Ford pickup into town to the parts store. The new pressure plate assembly and clutch disc cost him nearly $200, a painful amount of money when cash was tight. But it was a fraction of the cost of a new tractor payment. He spent the next 2 days meticulously cleaning every part. He scrubbed the grease and grime from the bell housing. He used emery cloth to carefully smooth the hot spots on the flywheel, checking it for flatness with a straight edge. He cleaned the splines on the input shaft until they shone. His mother brought his meals out to the barn, her face etched with worry. Silas, maybe that Gable boy is right, she said softly. Your father worked himself into an early grave, trying to fix everything himself. Dad also died a free man, Mom, Silas replied, not looking up from his work. I aim to do the same. He wrestled the new heavy pressure plate into place, carefully aligning the clutch disc with an alignment tool. Then came the hardest part, rolling the 2 halves of the tractor back together. It was a delicate, dangerous dance of hydraulic jacks and wooden blocks, nudging the massive multi-ton pieces of iron fractions of an inch at a time, until the dowel pins and the input shaft slid home with a satisfying solid thunk. By the 3rd evening, covered in grease from head to toe, his knuckles bruised and bleeding, he bolted the frame rails back together, reconnected the hydraulic lines and wiring, and lowered the machine off the jacks. He climbed into the seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, filling the barn with its familiar, powerful rhythm. He pushed in the new clutch. It was smooth, firm. He slipped the transmission into gear, and it engaged without a grind. A slow smile spread across his face. He hadn't just fixed his tractor. He had stared down the temptation of the easy way, the modern way, and he had won. He had saved himself from a monthly payment that would have been a chain around his neck. That victory, earned with his own 2 hands, felt better than any air-conditioned cab ever could. The 1970s rolled in like a warm front, bringing with them a kind of delirious optimism that settled over the heartland. It started with whispers of big grain deals with the Soviets, and soon those whispers became headlines. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly shot past $2, then $3. Land values, which had been flat for a generation, doubled, and then doubled again. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling farmers to get big or get out, to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The banks, flush with cash, were eager to lend against the ballooning value of the land. It was a gold rush, and the fertile black soil of the Midwest was the new frontier. Tom Gable became the poster child for the boom. He used his rapidly appreciating land as collateral to secure massive loans. He bought the 80 acres to his south, then the 160 to his north. His farm swelled to over 1,000 acres. The local paper did a story on him, calling him a progressive agriculturalist. He traded in his IH 856 for a brand new John Deere 4640, a true beast of a machine with a turbocharged engine, a sound guard cab that was quieter than a luxury car, and 8 massive tires that left a footprint like a tank. He bought a new Gleaner combine, the biggest they made, and a fleet of new grain trucks. He was making money, and he was spending it just as fast, all of it on Rick Jennings's and the bank's credit. He built a new house for his family, a sprawling ranch-style home with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway, a stark contrast to the modest, 100-year-old farmhouses that dotted the landscape. Silas, meanwhile, was also benefiting from the high grain prices. For the first time in his life, there was a surplus of money after the bills were paid. His mother urged him to use it as a down payment on the quarter section next to theirs that was coming up for sale. "It's your chance, son," she'd pleaded. "Everyone is expanding. You'll be left behind." But his father's words were a constant echo in his mind. Instead of going to the bank, Silas took his profits and drove to the courthouse. He paid off the last of the mortgage on their original 320 acres. The clerk, a woman who had known his father, stamped the deed, paid in full, and slid it across the counter to him. Holding that piece of paper, free and clear, felt like a greater accomplishment than owning 1,000 acres on a banker's dime. He didn't stop there. He used the profits from the next year to re-roof the big hip-roof barn and put a new concrete floor in his workshop. He bought a used International 966 tractor, not as new or fancy as Gable's, but it was a solid, reliable machine that he paid for with a single check. It allowed him to get his fieldwork done faster, and it meant he had a dependable backup if the 40C20 ever went down for major repairs again. The rest of the money, the significant amount left over, he put into savings bonds and a simple savings account at the small-town bank. He was building a fortress, not an empire. To his neighbors, he was an enigma, a fool. They saw Gable driving his new equipment, buying land, living high on the hog, and they saw Silas, still in his old 4020, still living in the same old house, still driving the same rusty Ford pickup. The talk at the co-op was merciless. "Poor Silas," one would say, shaking his head. "He's got no vision. He could be a millionaire on paper right now like Tom Gable, but he's too scared to take a risk." "It's not fear," another would counter. "It's just plain stubbornness. His father was the same way, never wanted to owe a dime, died with nothing but a clear name to show for it." One afternoon, Tom Gable pulled his shiny new pickup to the end of Silas's lane. Silas was out by the fence, stretching new barbed wire. "Blackwood," Gable called out, not bothering to get out of his truck. "I'm making you an offer. I'll give you 3,000 an acre for this whole place. That's top dollar, more than it's worth. You can take the money, move to town, get a nice easy job. You're not cut out for this new kind of farming." Silas didn't even look up from his work, pulling the wire taut with his stretcher. "It's not for sale, Tom." "Don't be a fool," Gable pressed, his voice laced with annoyance. "In 5 years, I'll own everything from here to the river. I'm just giving you a chance to get out with your pockets full before you get swallowed up." "This farm was my grandfather's," Silas said, his voice low and steady as he hammered in a staple. "It was my father's, and it's mine. It's not for sale." Gable snorted in disgust and peeled away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle over Silas's work. The good times kept rolling. The mid-70s were a blur of high yields and even higher prices. But Silas started to notice things, the price of fuel creeping up, the cost of fertilizer nearly doubling in 1 year. On the radio, he'd catch snippets of news from back east. A man named Paul Volcker was appointed to the Federal Reserve. The news anchor talked about fighting inflation, about tightening the money supply. At the bank one day, old Mr. Abernathy, the bank president who had given his father his first loan, pulled Silas aside. "Silas," the old banker said, his voice barely a whisper, "I'm retiring next year. These new fellas, they don't think the same way we did. They're handing out money like it's candy at a parade. I see the books. I see the debt men like Tom Gable are carrying. The interest rate on his operating note just went from 8% to 11%. He doesn't even seem to care." Mr. Abernathy put a hand on Silas's shoulder. His skin felt like old paper. You keep doing what you're doing, son. You remember your father. When this party ends, and believe me, it will end, there's going to be a hangover like nobody has ever seen. Make sure you're the one holding the aspirin, not the empty bottle. That winter, the first snows came early. The news was full of reports about American hostages in Iran and a new president being elected. The interest rates, which had seemed like a distant problem, were now the lead story every night. 12%, 15, 18. The numbers were staggering, unbelievable. Silas sat by the wood stove in his living room, the paid-off deed to his farm safe in a lockbox, listening to the wind howl outside. It sounded like a warning. The world was changing again, and a storm was coming. A storm that would wash away the proud and the overextended and test the foundations of men like him. A storm that would eventually lead him right back to the polished floors of the John Deere dealership, to a smug young salesman, and to a dusty old ledger that held the truth of the last 15 years. Rick Jennings returned, a cloud of dust puffing from the heavy cloth-bound ledger he dropped onto the counter. He blew on the cover, sending more dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light. He flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages, his manicured finger tracing down columns of handwritten entries. Silas waited, his silence a stark contrast to the hum of the soda machine in the corner. "Here we are," Rick said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Blackwood, Silas. Account started by my father in 1958. He ran his finger down the page, his smirk growing. "Lots of little entries here. A set of spark plugs for the Model A. A fan belt. Gallon of 30-weight oil." He looked up at Tom Gable, who was leaning against a brand-new disc bine, thoroughly enjoying the show. The last entry was in 1971. "Looks like you paid for a hydraulic hose and had a credit of $7.42. Rick tapped the page. "So there's your balance, Silas. $7.42. You want that in cash, or you want to put it toward a new keychain?" Silas didn't move. "That's not the account," he said, his voice calm. "My father opened another one. A different ledger. He called it the sinking fund." Rick stared at him blankly. "The what?" "Sinking fund," Silas repeated, "for major overhauls, a way of saving. He put money in it every fall after he sold his grain. $100. Sometimes $200 if the year was good. He told me he wanted a place to keep the money safe for the iron, separate from the household account. Your father handled it for him." Rick's face was a mask of disbelief. He looked at Tom, who just shrugged, the smirk faltering slightly. This was a strange, archaic concept that didn't compute in their world of revolving credit and leveraged assets. "Silas, nobody does that," Rick said, shaking his head. "This is an implement dealership, not a bank. My dad might have done some old-fashioned things, but I cleaned all that up when I took over." "Check again," Silas insisted, his gaze as steady as a fence post. "It was a blue ledger, smaller than that one." With a long theatrical sigh, Rick disappeared back into the office. The sounds of shuffling boxes and muttered curses drifted out. Tom Gable shifted his weight, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. The joke was wearing thin. When Rick returned, he was holding a smaller, dusty blue book, holding it away from his polo shirt as if it were contaminated. He opened it on the counter, and this time he didn't smile. The pages were filled with his father's neat, deliberate script. November 1968, deposit, $150. Balance, $150. October 1969, deposit, $200. Balance, $350. November 1970, deposit, $200. Balance, $550. The entries continued, year after year, through the entire boom of the 70s. Silas, after paying off the farm, had continued the tradition, but the deposits grew larger. $500. $1,000. $1,500 in 1978, a year the corn had yielded 200 bushels to the acre. Rick's finger traced the column of numbers, his jaw slowly tightening. He turned the page. The final entry was from the previous fall. The balance at the bottom of the page was written in clear, undeniable figures. Rick stared at it, his face paling. He swallowed hard. "What is it?" Tom Gable asked, pushing himself off the disc-bine and walking over. He peered over Rick's shoulder at the ledger. His eyes widened and the smug look on his face evaporated, replaced by stunned silence. Rick Jennings slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Silas's. The mockery was gone, replaced by a look of grudging, confused respect. "Your balance," Rick said, his voice barely a whisper, "is $17,450. An invisible wall had just shifted in the room. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a relic. He was a man with a fortress of cash sitting in the heart of his enemy's territory. He hadn't come to beg for credit. He hadn't come to argue about a bill. He had come to check on his ammunition. "Thank you, Rick," Silas said quietly. He nodded once, turned, and walked out of the dealership, the glass door hissing shut behind him, leaving the two men standing in stunned silence over a dusty blue book that represented a philosophy they could not comprehend. That spring of 1980, the sky turned to brass. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey plate. The corn which had sprouted with such promise in the moist April soil stopped growing. By June it was barely knee-high, the leaves curling inward during the day as the plants desperately tried to conserve what little moisture they had. The air was thick with a hazy dust that never settled, and the ponds in the pastures shrank, their edges receding into muddy, hoof-pocked flats. Tom Gable's 1,000 acres were a disaster. He had planted fence row to fence row, pouring thousands of dollars of borrowed money into seed and fertilizer, all of it now withering under the relentless sun. The stress on him was visible. His face was perpetually flushed, his temper short. He drove his pickup too fast down the gravel roads, trailing a permanent plume of angry dust. One afternoon in early July, Silas was in his workshop, grinding the valves on the head of his Farmall M's engine, when he heard the roar of a big diesel coming down his lane. It was Tom Gable's massive John Deere 4640, limping along, a thick plume of black smoke pouring from its exhaust stack. It died 20 yards from the shop. Tom climbed down from the quiet cab, his face streaked with sweat and grease. "It's the turbo," he spat, kicking one of the giant rear tires. "Thing just let go, pouring oil into the exhaust. I need to get the last of my soybeans cultivated before the weeds take them over completely." "That's a tough break, Tom," Silas said, wiping his hands on a rag. "A tough break." Gable laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "It's a $5,000 break. I called Jennings. He can get a new turbo cartridge, but he wants the money up front. Said the bank put a hold on my credit line. Can you believe that? After all the business I've done with him." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't have $5,000 in cash. It's all tied up in this crop." Silas looked at the massive, silent green tractor. It was a marvel of engineering, but right now it was as useless as a boulder. He then glanced at his old International 966, parked under the shade of an oak tree, a 4-row cultivator mounted on its 3-point hitch. It wasn't fancy, but it ran. "I'm about done with my beans," Silas said. "You're welcome to use my 966 and cultivator for a few days if it'll help." Gable stared at him, then at the older, smaller tractor. He looked as if Silas had offered him a horse and a walking plow. Pride warred with desperation on his face. Finally, desperation won. "Yeah," he mumbled, not looking Silas in the eye. "Yeah, I'd appreciate that." As Tom Gable spent the next 2 days on Silas's open-station tractor, eating dust under the hot sun, the news on the radio went from bad to worse. The president had announced a full-grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The export market vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been holding over $3 a bushel on the hope of exports, collapsed to under $2. For farmers like Tom, who had borrowed money based on $3 corn, it was a death sentence. The drought broke in August with a series of violent thunderstorms, but it was too late. The corn was already pollinated, the yields already set in stone. The rain did nothing but make the weeds grow and rot what little crop was left in the fields. That fall, the harvest was a grim, silent affair. The talk at the co-op was no longer about expansion and new equipment. It was about survival. And hanging over it all was the spectre of the prime interest rate, which had just crested 20%. The party was officially over. The winter of 1981 was cold and quiet, a quiet that felt heavy and full of dread. It was the calm before the storm broke. By spring, the first foreclosure notices began appearing in the county paper, small print listings that represented the end of generational dreams. The first auction was for the Miller Place, a small dairy farm 2 miles down the road. Silas went, not to bid, but to bear witness. The scene was heartbreaking. The Miller family stood by their modest house, their faces pale and drawn, as the auctioneer, a man with a professionally cheerful voice, sold off their lives piece by piece. Their tractors, their cows, their tools, even the kitchen table and the children's swing set. Neighbors bought what they could, often just to give it back to the family, but out-of-town bidders with ready cash snapped up the big-ticket items for pennies on the dollar. The air was thick with a mixture of grief, shame, and fear. Every farmer there was doing the math in their head, wondering if they were next. For Tom Gable, the end came swiftly. The bank, now run by a new, hard-faced president from the city, refused to extend his operating note for the 1982 season. They called in his loans. He had no cash reserves. The value of his land, which had been his collateral and his pride, had plummeted by more than half. He was trapped. One bright May morning, 2 long black lowboy trucks from the green and gold dealership rumbled down the gravel road and turned into Tom Gable's new paved driveway. Rick Jennings got out of the lead truck, holding a clipboard. He didn't look triumphant, just weary and grim. This wasn't a profitable sale. It was a messy, unpleasant cleanup. Silas was mending fence along the line between their properties and watched the whole thing from a distance. He saw Rick and Tom exchange sharp words. He saw Tom's wife come out of the house, pleading. But the paperwork was undeniable. The repo men, practiced and efficient, fired up the big 4640 and drove it onto the first trailer. Then came the Gleaner combine, its huge grain head looming over the truck cab like some prehistoric monster. They took the planter, the big chisel plow, the grain trucks. Within 2 hours, Tom Gable's impressive machine shed, once a symbol of progress and prosperity, stood half empty, a hollowed-out carcass. The only things left were the old small machines his father had owned, tucked away in the back corner, worthless as collateral to the bank. The final blow came a month later. A large wooden sign was hammered into the ground at the end of his lane. Farm auction, by order of the First National Bank. 1,020 acres, house and buildings. Silas survived. It wasn't easy. The low grain prices meant he was barely breaking even. But his costs were a fraction of his neighbors. His fuel bill was lower because he ran smaller tractors. His fertilizer bill was manageable because he wasn't trying to push the land for maximum yield, just a sustainable one. And crucially, there were no interest payments bleeding him dry. While others were paying 22 cents on every dollar they borrowed just to put a crop in, Silas was using the cash from his savings account. He repaired his own equipment in his own shop, using parts he paid for with the money from that blue ledger at the dealership. He was an island of stability in a sea of red ink. His father's words had become a prophecy fulfilled. A man who owns what he stands on is a king. The day of the Gable auction was bright and windy, the kind of day that whips the flags and makes your eyes water. The yard was packed with trucks and cars from 3 counties. It had the morbid carnival-like atmosphere of a public tragedy. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant echoed across the farmstead, a cadence of finality. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He saw Tom near the machine shed, leaning against the wall, a vacant look in his eyes. He looked 10 years older than he had the year before. His wife was nowhere to be seen. The men who had once clapped him on the back and called him a genius now avoided his gaze, their own fear and guilt keeping them at a distance. The auction for the land began. An out-of-state insurance company, represented by a man in a suit, bought the largest tracts of land, the ones Tom had acquired during the boom. They paid less than half of what Tom had borrowed against them. It was a bloodbath. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last parcel. All right, folks, now we have the home quarter. 160 acres, with the house, the barn, and all the buildings. A fine, productive piece of ground, the original Gable family homestead. The bidding started low. A few local farmers made tentative bids, but they were stretched thin themselves. The man in the suit from the insurance company entered the bidding, his voice crisp and confident. The locals dropped out one by one, shaking their heads. It seemed the entire farm was destined to be swallowed by a faceless corporation. Sold then, to the gentleman from... The auctioneer began, raising his gavel. Wait, A voice called out from the back. It was calm, steady and clear. Every head turned. It was Silas. He had his hand raised. The auctioneer grinned. "Well, look here, Silas Blackwood has decided to join the party. I have a bid of $600 an acre from the insurance company. Do I hear 610, Silas?" "610, Silas said, his voice even. The man in the suit immediately countered. 620. 630, Silas replied without hesitation. A murmur went through the crowd. This was Backward Blackwood, the man who never took a risk, bidding against an insurance company for the most expensive parcel of the day. They didn't understand. They didn't know about the paid-off land he'd used as collateral for a modest, responsible loan from the old banker's successor, a loan secured by real assets, not inflated paper value. They didn't know about the fortress he had built while they were all building castles of sand. The bidding went back and forth. The price climbed. 700, 750. The man in the suit was getting flustered, constantly checking his notes. This wasn't in his script. Finally, at $810 an acre, Silas made his bid. The man in the suit conferred with a colleague on his cell phone, then shook his head and lowered his bidding card. 810 once. 810 twice. Sold, the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down. To Silas Blackwood. A wave of stunned applause rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just that a local had won, it was that Silas had won. The man they had all underestimated had just saved the heart of his rival's farm from being absorbed into oblivion. After the auction, as the crowd dispersed, Silas walked over to where Tom was still standing, looking at the ground. Tom didn't look up. "I suppose you're here to gloat," Tom said, his voice thick with defeat. "To tell me you told me so." "No, Tom," Silas said softly, "I'm not." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They were the keys to the house. "My mother passed away last winter. My house is empty and quiet. This place needs a family in it. It's your family's home." Tom finally looked up, his eyes filled with confusion and shame. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you staying," Silas said. "You can rent the farmstead and the home quarter from me. The terms will be fair. You know this land better than anyone. You can farm it with your father's old equipment, start over, smaller, smarter." Tears welled in Tom Gable's eyes, the first crack in the dam of his broken pride. He looked at Silas, at the man he had mocked and belittled for years, who was now offering him not charity, but a chance at dignity. "Why?" Tom choked out. "After everything. Why would you do this for me?" Silas looked out over the fields, the wind rustling the dry stalks of last year's corn. "Because this land is unforgiving," he said. "It doesn't care about our pride or our ambition, and the bankers don't care about our families. All we have is each other. We're neighbors. That's got to mean something." Years melted away like snow in April. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The farm economy slowly healed, scarred but wiser. Silas Blackwood never became a wealthy man in the way the world measured it. He never farmed 1,000 acres or drove the newest, biggest tractor. But he became rich in other ways. His farm was his own. His name was a synonym for integrity at the bank and the co-op. The nickname Backward Blackwood was long forgotten, replaced by a quiet, deeply held respect. Younger farmers, wary of the siren song of easy credit their fathers had fallen for, would often stop by his workshop seeking his advice. He'd show them how to rebuild a water pump or time an injection system, and in between he'd talk to them about assets and liabilities, about the difference between a tool and a status symbol. Tom Gable never left the home farm. He farmed the 160 acres he rented from Silas and eventually bought it back, paying Silas every cent with interest. The two men were never close friends, but a bond of mutual respect had been forged in the crucible of the crisis. They were neighbors, and that meant something. One crisp autumn afternoon, Silas stood in that same workshop, the light streaming through the dusty windows. The old John Deere 4020 was parked inside, its green paint faded and worn, but its engine humming a steady, reliable tune. Kneeling by the rear wheel was his grandson, a boy of 16 with Silas's dark hair and his father's quiet eyes. Silas was showing him how to bleed the air from the injector lines after changing a fuel filter. You see, Silas said, his voice a low rumble over the engine's idle. You can't be afraid of this iron. You have to learn its language. You have to know how to listen to it, how to heal it when it's sick. A man who can fix his own machine is a man who controls his own destiny. The boy carefully cracked the nut on the injector line, watching for the clean, bubble-free stream of diesel fuel. He tightened it back up, his movements sure and confident. "Grandpa," the boy asked, wiping his hands on a red rag, "why do we still use this old tractor? Dad said we could afford a new one now, one with a cab and air conditioning." Silas smiled, a slow spreading of wrinkles around his eyes. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Because this tractor," he said, patting the warm fender, "tells a story. It's not about having the newest or the biggest. It's about having what's yours. It's about the freedom you feel when you turn the key in the morning, knowing that the only one you owe for it is yourself. Your great-grandfather taught me that, and I'm teaching it to you. Land and iron, son. They're a part of you. But debt is a chain. And this family, we aim to be free." He looked out the open barn door, across his fields of rich black earth, golden in the late afternoon sun. The land was paid for. The machines were paid for. The lessons had been learned, and the legacy was secure. And in the quiet hum of the old diesel engine, Silas Blackwood heard the sound of victory.